Good afternoon. I'm Elizabeth Horner. I'm the Director of Education at the Michael C. Carlos Museum at Emory University, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's program. This lecture is part of a Emory University class on the avatars of Vishnu that is taught by Ellen Goff, Assistant Professor in Emory's Department of Religion, and it's cross-listed through the Art History Department and the Religion Department. And the undergraduates and graduate students in this class have been researching paintings in the Carlos Museum's collection all semester and will be curating an exhibition, which they have titled The Avatars of Vishnu, which opens Saturday, April 24th in our Works on Paper gallery. And they've been working very hard, and we're very excited for people to come and see this exhibition. The museum is now open, and people can visit by making reservations at carlos.emory.edu. The course, the exhibition, Dr. Ghosh's visit, and the other lectures in conjunction with the show were all made possible through the generous financial support of the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation and the Christian Humann Foundation. And we are grateful to both of those foundations for making projects like this that connect student research with museum collections and exhibitions, and also public lectures like this one possible. So thank you so much. And it's my pleasure right now to cede the virtual podium to Dr. Ellen Goff, who will introduce today's speaker. Thank you, Ellen.
Great. Thank you, Elizabeth. It's my pleasure today to welcome to the Carlos Museum, Dr. Pika Ghosh, who is a visiting associate professor of religion at Haverford College in Pennsylvania, and really one of the great scholars of South Asian art in America today, with numerous publications to her name. Her first book, published in 2005, Temple to Love, Architecture and Devotion in 17th Century Bengal, looks at the history and ritual use of a particular type of Bengali Hindu temple that combines features of sultanate mosques and thatched houses to create both a place of worship and a loving playground for Krishna and his beloved Radha. She's the editor of Fashioning the Divine, South Asian Sculpture at the Ackland Art Museum, a really exquisitely illustrated catalog of the exhibit of classical Indian sculpture she curated in 2007 at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. It's been a great help for this course as we look to curate an exhibit of our own. And her most recent book, published in 2020, about which she will talk today, is titled Making Kanta, Making Home, Women at Work in Colonial Bengal. I should say that I first encountered Professor Ghosh's work in grad school in a course on the art of India, where we read her Temple to Love. And it was my favorite book of the course. And it was such a breath of fresh air because it was one of the few books we read that rigorously combined so many different approaches, textual, historical, and ethnographic. In fact, it was one of the few books we read that really incorporated ethnographic materials. So I'm really thankful that Professor Ghosh can visit our class on the Avatars of Vishnu on Tuesday, because her work and her talk today will help us place these images of God within the domestic lives of devotees. I think it'll be important for us to take God outside of the museum, outside of the temple, and begin to understand the myriad of ways in which Hindus interact with the divine. So please join me in welcoming Pika Ghosh, who will present her talk at Hari's Feet, Embroidering a Space of One's Own in Colonial Bengal.
Thank you, Ellen, for that generous introduction. And thank you, Elizabeth, for inviting me, and to everybody who has given up this marvelously, sunshiny spring Sunday afternoon to looking at textiles with me. I hope, well, this is one of my most favorite Kantha, I will confess, one that I have had the pleasure of visiting since my very first year of graduate school in Philadelphia. And so that's about 30 years now. And it is one that I have gone back to many, many times, to work on small shows, big shows. And there's still stuff about it that I would like to learn more about. But I do believe it is appropriate for a beautiful spring day like this to look at Krishna's, celestial landscape embroidered exquisitely by, a superlative needleworker. So Kantha, these textiles, these Bengali textiles that survived from the 19th and first part of the 20th century in both homes and museum collections, share features that distinguish them as a regional product. They consist of layers of heavily used, worn fabric, usually extracted from garments, women's saris, men's dhotis, as you see here, Shagarmoni demonstrating. These recycled layers, valued for softness, are typically secured at the corners. Yeah? And they may be strengthened with white running stitches, but not necessarily so, And the quality of the running stitch can vary from being loose to more dense, creating different rhythms and texturing the surface while repairing at the same time, right? On top of that, the surface may be further embellished with embroidery in colored thread to create what are used as mats, blankets, shawls, covers for the most part. This kantha is exclusively adorned with imagery associated with Krishna, the devotional focus of the Bengali Vaishnava tradition. I'm especially interested in this practice for its potential to cultivate internal transformations, invisible yet invaluable, within the women who engaged in such stitch work. While I'm persuaded that kantha have always been collaborative enterprises at multiple levels, this particular one demonstrates a remarkable coherence in its imagery, aesthetic, and uniformity of execution that suggests the presence of an individual maker's hand. As traces of a meditative practice, the textile thus suggests participation in the refining of selves and lives. And I would like to ask how we might understand the agency of textiles in the making of Bengali women's experiences and perceptions integral to their everyday lives. To do so, I examine this kantha, which I juxtapose with ethnographic research among women, such as here you see the Nag Chaudhuris, who have worked over a lifetime making kantha in their home, in the afternoons while children were in school, at night by candlelight when there was rationing of electricity in Kolkata, and now with greater leisure as the household responsibilities have decreased, as they have grown older, to enjoy themselves at it. Although some threads have worn away, making a complete reading of the original inscription impossible, the stitched words that are legible, together with her choice of imagery, articulate the maker, Kamala's investment in her work. Draped on my body, on this garment, I write thus, at the feet of Hari, Krishna, his servant Kamala. Arriving in Vrindavan, Sri Radha and Krishna. Those are the parts that are very, are distinct and clear, but there's significant gaps. Yeah. So from these stitched words, we can see an invocation of her body, Ongo, the textile she has created, perhaps from cloth extracted from her worn garments, Vastro, and a relationship sought between her body and that of the divine through her embroidered words and images. I suggest the textile thereby visualizes her quest to locate herself at Krishna's feet, that is Hari's feet, a Charan, to find her place in his celestial abode in Vrindavan. Conversely, creating a sacred universe through exceptionally sophisticated arrangements and choices of motifs, along with her technical skill, surely affords her the opportunity to define that relationship for herself. And she uses the phrase likhilam iti, I write thus, asserting a kind of textual literacy that is not so very common in the mid-19th century among Bengali women. In fact, The education of Bengali women was a much debated topic in colonial India. Together, these aspects of the inscription persuade me that behind the words was surely a woman of some self-assurance, perhaps one who takes pride in her creativity, in even virtuosity. The process of creating this cosmology stitch by stitch and locating herself therein is a spiritual practice grounded in the body. The evenness of stitch length and spacing are visible traces of a rhythm between eye and hand, the sureness of habituated practice that would have allowed the needleworker to slip away from her surroundings even. Following the tip of her needle with a sure hand, she might have fleetingly felt part of a larger entity, in sync with the cosmic. And that flow may have induced the kind of exhilaration that kantha makers today describe, when time stood still in the wee hours of the night as their fingers couldn't stop puncturing cloth surfaces. They used terms such as nisha, addiction even, to describe their experiences. If Kamala was single-mindedly focused on these vegetal, animal, and figural forms flowering at her fingertips, Huteota, that sense of harmony could perhaps be identified with Vrindavan, Krishna's celestial realm, as it was emerging in her own hands. Her visualization of this cosmology can be situated with the work of others, whose choices suggest more overtly that embroidery is indeed a spiritual activity. Rows of popular and potent prayers, such as Hare Krishna, Hare Ram, stitched as if vocalized silently, may have manifested these deities in the hands of skilled embroiderers. This mantra, called the Mahamantra, reverberates in homes, temples, and streets in Bengali towns and villages to this day. In the Vaishnava community, such remembrance of Krishna in these repeated articulations of his name is believed to be one of the most effective modes of reaching him. Stitched repetition of sacred words, along with the repetition of uniform stitches to create them, may have been a process then of cultivating a meditative state, not so different from women chanting the names of God at their home altars or with prayer beads. The pattern of executing the running stitch between needle, cloth, and fingers, implementing it with speed and precision, is inherently bodily. The movement of the fingers, guiding the needle, then raising the arm to pull it, connects mind and body. In Paul Connaughton's terms, the memory for such skill is sedimented or amassed in the body. The body serves as the starting point of the activity, and the product is defined and delimited by it. So, from this phenomenological perspective, stitching can be understood as a viscerally grounded meditation. The role of embroidery as devotional expression, however, is one that has not been afforded much scholarly attention. Through personal example, the Bengali saint Chaitanya, and his dates are 1486 to 1533. Chaitanya had promoted an intensely individual and emotional response to Krishna worship. The primary texts of the tradition recommend remembering Krishna's stories as a way of doing so. Worship is thus understood as a transformative experience engaging body, sense, and mind. These basic tenets acquire a distinctive nuance in embroidery as practice. Through the choice and arrangement of words and images, embroidered devotion perhaps transforms the kantha into an offering. And conversely, the inherent tactility of cloth and stitching offer a woman a medium to explore the fundamental bhakti or devotional intertwining of worshipper and the divine. Yet others presented the performance of these sacred words in kirtan, songs of praise that are sung, calling attention to the relationship of voicing the mantra while visualizing them in needlework. Kantha sheathed with stitched mantra also incorporated Vaishnava emblems, such as conch shell, lotus, mace, and you see the footprint at the center of the kantha on the right. And indeed, narrations of Krishna's life stories. Such shawls would have draped the body of the wearer, enfolded her or him within its protection. Like these kantha, Kamala's work articulates a woman's devotional worldview, one that could have been extended in its use, perhaps to other people if shared. The emotional flow between the bodies of devotee and deity is also not unidirectional. Consonant with the bhakti premise of sharing, Krishna is believed to have needed the love of his worshippers to sustain himself as much as they yearned a place at his feet in his divine abode. And his consort, Radha, is adored by Bengali Vaishnavas as embodiment of that desire. She's called Radha Rani, given pride of place as God came down to earth to savor the sweetness of her love, Madhurjo. Radha thus occupies a central role as conduit for the devotee to reach him. And by extension, we might understand this textile as Kamala's invitation to Krishna and Radha to inhabit the space that she has created. Another aspect of the creativity of these kantha inheres in combining designs and stories to express new visions to adorn recycled fabric surfaces. The range of motifs and narratives is shared with other expressive forms circulating at the time, visual, performed, and literary. A careful examination suggests that they selected from this rich regional repertoire, sometimes skillfully juxtaposing images and stories, raising issues, creating identities through variations of color, size, composition. And we will look at some of these together today. Emanating from the rosy tip of this ripe seed-laden lotus at the center are 4 such scenes filling each of the lengths of the kantha, square kantha. These episodes have been popular since the Bengali community devoted to Krishna coalesced in the 16th and 17th centuries. And Kamala's interpretation then presents her vision through her selection from this available repertoire. In deltaic Bengal, a crisscrossing web of distributaries of 2 major river systems, flooded annually by torrential monsoons, water is ubiquitous. And on this kantha, water is the site of pleasures such as lotus blossoms burgeoning at the center and at the 4 corners of this kantha. Although lotuses are typically pink or white, blue lotuses were imagined in the Bengali Ramayana. These flowers were obtained by Ram, offered to the goddess Durga, when he sought her help to overcome the demon Ravana in the big battle of the epic. These blue flowers at the 4 corners perhaps explicate Krishna's relationship to Ram. And Krishna, if you recall, is also known as Ramanuj, that is the younger one of Ram. Moreover, the embroiderer identifies herself as Kamala, that is lotus. Her choice of visual elements, including perhaps an elaboration of her own name, thus grounds the selected stories in relation to herself. And the verdant foliage includes globular golden blossoms of the kadam or kadamba tree, a favored spot for many of Krishna's exploits, many trysts with Radha. These anchor the 4 corners of the square textile. Nauka Bilash, Krishna's boat ride with Radha and the gopis across the Yamuna river, spreads across the length of the kantha between 2 of these green trees. She has chosen a particularly popular boat type called the Mayurpankhi, a peacock feathered boat. This light, richly ornamented boat is pillared and canopied. It is a pleasure boat, very popular in colonial India. The blue of the peacock prow balances the dark-skinned Krishna poised at its tail, and the plumes radiate outwards from its downturned neck to complement the feather in his headdress. Krishna is the boatman, casually dangling an oar from one hand, raising a flute to his lips with the other. The gopis, the cowherding women who were part of Radha's following, bearing dairy goods, align themselves in two tiers in a composition that bears striking resemblance to contemporary renditions such as this print now in the British Museum's collection. Radha is given pride of place in the covered pavilion. Closest to Krishna is Borai Buri, the elderly widow who served as a liaison, orchestrating trysts with Radha. Her raised hand suggests such an act of conspiring with him. And the image conflates many rides that Krishna offered the dairymaids across the river, one of numerous opportunities that he sought to waylay them and to seduce Radha in particular. In her choice of the boat type, color, and composition, Kamala thus relocates the divine dalliance to the Bengal Delta, making the eternal play of the gods familiar and contemporary, as also seen in this woodcut print. 15th century Bengali poets such as Chandidash and Vidyapati offered the earliest surviving articulations of this episode, which became immensely popular in 17th century temple terracotta panels and in Baluchari sari weaves. Indeed, it continues to be retold today in numerous contexts, including the popular storytelling scrolls or pots of the region. In Chondidas's version, Krishna's dinghy could only hold 2 people at a time, so he ferried each gopi individually, taking Radha last to demand her jewelry and her affections as payment. And I quote, "If I'm to ferry you, give your necklace on deposit. Since I saw your moonlight face, I've staked out the Yamuna. Now if you'll consent, I'll take you at once. I've immersed my thoughts in you. Hold me tight, make good the tolls. That's what I crave." On the other hand, the 19th century urban poet Ram Boshu voiced the concerns of women undertaking such journeys. Quote, "Taking me into the boat, the rake started all his tricks. He said, 'See, Rai, the Jamuna is turbulent. You wore a blue garment. Mistaking it for the clouds, the wind is excited. In the middle of the river, then, he asked me to strip. Alas, where am I to hide my shame?'" And a third version is that of Vidyapati, who imagined the incident from Radha's viewpoint as well, but with significantly different nuance. And I quote, "On sharp currents of the river, the boat was launched, but Krishna was young, he could not steer. So I swam across. My bracelet snapped, my necklace broke. Friend, don't scold me. My earrings dropped. I searched for them till dusk. My makeup washed away. My breasts were scratched with thorns." Says Vidyapati, "You talk so plausibly, people might even believe you." And his comment at the end indicates that her recounting of the event is at variance with the evidence on her body. Instead, he points to that special sweetness of the Radha-Krishna relationship that was prized by the Gauriyas. Married to another man, marked by red shindur in her hair, Radha had to undergo great difficulties to keep these trysts, to manage her loyalties. And in compromising her social standing for the divine, forsaking all else for him, she offered the paradigm for devotion. But this boat ride is further layered with another well-known encounter, identified explicitly as Dan Kondo, or the collection of toll. The term directs our attention to the dairy goods on these women's heads. They are from the cowherding families, and their job was to process the dairy. Krishna, as tax collector, blocked Radha's way, again planning to seduce her. In Chondidash's verse, quote, "Underneath a tree beside the Yamuna, that is Krishna's station. You cannot evade me, Radha, using tricks or speeches. Offer me your love in place of payment. I am Krishna. I collect taxes on this highway. Why don't you make good your taxes, Radha? Opposite the boat ride, on this kantha, Krishna rides a magical horse composed of 8 gopis. Such fantastic beasts, either horses or elephants, give visual form to the desire to unite with the divine. A gopi's raised hand serves as stirrup to support the feet of God. Another, probably Radha, leads the horse. She's privileged, as in the boat's pavilion. If Krishna traps her on the boat and on the way to the market, now she leads his horse. It is Radha who controls the lovesick youth. And this composite animal is a long-standing Vaishnava motif, shared across temple terracottas and by the 19th century in prints and watercolors. Shared also, of course, with Sufi imagery, right, in Sultanate and Mughal manuscripts. A third panel displays the baby Krishna stealing butter from his mother's kitchen, which culminates in a miracle in the everyday course of Yashoda's life when he offered her a view of the cosmos. Here, Yashoda finds the boy with his hands in the churn as she is working. He has slipped boldly between her and the churn, helping himself. North Indian versions tend to identify the coveted delicacy as fresh butter or cream, but Bengali versions often feature yogurt. The Bengali sweet yogurt, Mishti Doi, continues to be associated with Krishna across the region, from oral lore about particular icons such as Madan Mohan to offerings at altars today. And in fact, woodcuts and watercolor versions from the 19th century explicitly identify the episode as Dadhi Manthan, the churning of yogurt. In dipping his fingers into the container, the boy was polluting the food and rendering it unsuitable, either for consumption at home or sale. Behind Yashoda is the line of women who had complained about his truancy. But on the other side of the churn is the white-skinned brother, Balaram, basking in his mother's embrace, offering comparison between the interactions of these two mothers and sons. Rohini wraps her arms around her boy, holding him close, while Yashoda reprimands Krishna. Both expressions of the intense relationship of mothers and their children, called Vatsalya in the Vaishnava tradition. What follows is the miracle known to Kathameka and viewers surely. When Yashoda forced his mouth open, instead of butter or yogurt, she was privileged to glimpse the entire universe swirling. Krishna then restored his overwhelmed mother by erasing the memory of that vision. In another variant, when she attempts to tie him up by way of punishment, she is unable to do so, as the rope seems to extend infinitely. And she finally realizes that Krishna has miraculously made the rope endless to resist her rough treatment. The episode thus turns on a reversal, even if momentary, of Yashoda's role from caregiver to recipient of a revelation that Krishna shares with her. The tale is cherished for its promise of intimacy and accessibility in this interaction. Although the women are not differentiated visually in Kamala's Katha, viewers would have known that it was Yashoda alone who was privy to this miraculous vision, a reward for her dedication. The rest only saw the mischievous child who knocked over pots, overturned order in their homes. A female poet, Girindra Mohinidashi, born in 1858, perhaps contemporary with Kamala, explores this theme, extending the metaphor of theft from milk, dudhe chor, to that of her life and her body. Using skillful wordplay, incorporating the word horili, haran is to steal, and it incorporates Hari or Krishna. implying an integral etymological connection between theft and his very name. She goes on to suggest that such thefts are both personal losses, material and emotional losses, as well as the loss that she experienced through her immersion in Krishna, a loss of self, a loss of relationship to her own body, mind, affections, hunger, thirst, sleep, her present and her future. And I quote, "You took everything, Hari, what little I had. Where did you come from, O thief? Sitting in my lap, stealing my heart, cutting through my breast." She addresses the baby directly, in a voice reserved to the most familiar of relationships, imagining him sitting in her lap, yielding access to her heart and her emotions. And that immediacy is again invoked when she describes the toddler wandering through her home at will. Quote, "Crawling on all fours from room to room, your bloody lower lip splitting, revealing two milk teeth, ripples of laughter follow." Implicitly imagining herself as Yashoda, she sees him chasing around the house, and her reward is to receive his tender arms, clasping her neck in an embrace. Women who embroidered such images were likely familiar with Krishna in the form of the baby crawling with stolen treats in his hands that Girindra Mohini evokes, perhaps adoring this form of baby Krishna at their home altars. Here, they might engage with the deity with the kind of intensity that the poem suggests. They might have participated affectly in the care of icons, in daily devotions of bathing, feeding, singing to him at their altars. The embroidered version is thus likely to have been familiar to Bengali women such as Kamala from these kinds of diverse contexts. The episode was also embellished with familiar details of Bengali kitchens. One embroiderer chose to incorporate a cat and a bird at the bottom left corner of this scene. Both are frequent strays that intruded into the inner spaces of homes to snatch food as it was being prepared. They lurk near the boy and the churn, as if waiting for an opportunity for their share of the coveted food. The presence of these creatures invites comparison with Krishna's thievery. Unlike the petty thefts committed by these animals that left women exasperated, Krishna stole their hearts, and the intensity of their love left them vulnerable and defenseless. Further, he rewarded such adoration with miraculous visions, as with his mother. So the embroidered image perhaps offers a model for heightened awareness of the immanence of divinity in the ordinary activities of everyday life. It also visualizes transformations that are perhaps possible for ordinary women in their devotional engagement with Krishna in their homes. Directly across from this image is the divine couple, flanked here by 8 women, likely the select set of Radha's closest friends or gopis, who served as intercessors in devotion in the Gaudiya tradition. This scene appears much as it would have in a Krishna temple, such as this temple in Bishnupur. For celebrations such as the autumn reenactment of Rash, Krishna's circle dance with the gopis, celebrated since the Bhagavad Puran first articulated a description of it in the 10th century. Icons are arranged on the front porch of the temple to suggest a circle that opens up to incorporate the community of worshippers that would have gathered in front, singing and dancing. And woodcuts identify such arrangements explicitly as the great autumn dance of Krishna with the gopis. The imagery, crafted exquisitely, allows us an intimate glimpse into a woman's creation of a personal vision, her cosmology. As with most women around the world, the everyday lives of such ordinary Bengali women were rarely recorded before the 20th century. For many, Katha may well be the only trace of their presence to have survived, the only evidence from which to recover their viewpoints, to listen for their voices. And we should remember that most women at this time were not writing, memoirs or biographies, which is what makes these textiles really important for understanding Bengali women's worldviews. Katha imagery thus offers a valuable viewpoint into an otherwise obscured domain. And yet, of course, because we know relatively little about the particular lives of these individual women who embroidered Katha, we cannot reconstruct with too much precision the historical conditions or the specific criteria they weighed as they selected such motifs and tales and arranged them in particular sequences to arrive at Hari's feet. Thank you.
Oh, great. That was fabulous. Thank you so much for that talk. If you can share your questions in the Q&A, we can open it up to our question and answer session. Maybe as people are typing their questions in the chat, you can discuss the process of your research and maybe engaging with contemporary makers of these textiles. Who are these women? How did you meet them?
Sure. So there was a body of textiles. I first worked on these for an exhibition. Well, actually for several exhibitions in Philadelphia. The big one being the 2009 show, exclusively devoted to Katha, right? It was sort of at the rising curve of interest in textiles across art history. And for that project, I went back to Kolkata and Dhaka and began to track sort of, I wanted to catch a range of women, both urban and rural, to look across multiple social settings, to look across both Hindu and Muslim households. So in Kolkata, I was fortunate to have friends, anthropologists actually, Bengali anthropologists who sent me chasing their contacts. And so in a big city, I began to find a range of families. In Kolkata, for example, the women that you saw at the beginning of the talk, the two over there, Sagar Moni is actually from an East Bengali town in Khulna, right? She came in the 1960s, right after the partition, and settled here as a maid in that household with the Nag Chaudhuris. And it is there that she taught these women how to stitch Kantha, right? And by the time these women were widowed with not enough resources, and there's several of them, right? They were all making Kantha to support their family income. So it shifted from being pleasure time activity to being something that became much more serious, right? In their pleasure time activities, they would go to the museums in Kolkata to look at such Kantha, try to figure out the stitches, practice all the different border types, right? And stitch types. And so there's that kind of, Kantha practice. Another one that really intrigued me was a mid-19th century Kantha that survives. And this is what made me realize that, we have nothing but an object from this woman, right? Mm-hmm. It's lasted 8 generations, apparently, they claim, in this family. And they pulled it out for me to look at. And it's got a striking zebra in the middle, which is why I will never forget this thing. And because we find, more typically, we would find a floral kind of form, as in this Kantha. But when I asked about the woman, there was really not much more that anybody could say other than her name and her kantha, which really makes you realize that, most of everything of this woman's life is gone except this marvelous object she created that has been cherished clearly, right? Valued, prized. They take it out every year to put it in the sun. They wrap it up nicely and put it away at the end of the winter season. So it's valued. She is known by her handiwork across the generations, but not, with much more than the presence embodied in her textile, right? And that really made me appreciate these museum materials much more when I came back to look at them. Does
Right.
that help? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. That gives us some context for sure. Okay, we have some questions now in the Q&A. This one relates to discussion. You were just presenting. So Paula asks, could you explain the design process for this type of embroidery? Do the women sketch their design first and then transfer it to the fabric? Or is the process more spontaneous and iterative?
That's a good question. My hunch would be that there's many different options. We simply don't know enough. What we do know is that they did not use hoops, right, in this early period, because there's a lot of funky puckering in the middles. When you start at the corners and go to the middle, the unevenness shows, right? There's definitely underdrawing on most of the really high-end, intricate ones, right? One of the women I spoke to said a traditional way of doing that would be to use holud, turmeric, in water and use that for line drawing. Today, of course, there's enough pencil marks we find in contemporary Kanta. But even more than the embroidery, I think most women will talk about the layering of the textile as the most complex part of the process, right? To extricate fabric that is soft enough for the purpose. I mean, if you think of, wrapping up a newborn baby, for example, right? It has to be soft enough for the baby's skin, which is a different texture than a mat to sit outside, right? For a picnic. And to layer the cloth without wrinkling is apparently Kathapata is considered to be the hardest part. And that's why I kind of feel like there is an inevitable collaborative dimension to it, right? No single woman did this alone, even if they may have drawn or embroidered it entirely by themselves. We've implicitly got more hands that have become invisible, erased maybe even by the presence of the other one in her inscription, right?
Right. That relates to a few people's questions about how communal this process is. Is it a more of an individual effort? There was another question. Please elaborate on your comment that it is a collaborative exercise. Do you have any evidence in these textiles where you can see very different styles coming through, or?
Yes. I mean, this particular one is not a good example of that, obviously, right? It's just stunningly coherent, but it's the exception, I should say.
Okay.
Yeah. Sometimes you can tell different women started at the different corners.
Interesting.
So there'll be a looser hand and a tighter hand. That would be the easy way of telling them apart, but the same threads, right? Sometimes you find, somebody who's conceived of a textile in square blocks where you can begin to see some variation. Is it necessarily different hands? Maybe not, in the way, if you think of painters trying their hand at different styles, that would be another possibility. But for sure, when it's commercial production today, we see many hands, right? And of course, you know, when you think about objects like this, which show much repair over the generations, you've definitely got multiple hands, you know, inserting their presences upon the object, right?
Mm.
And we also don't know whether the person who draws well is also one who stitches well. So Shagor Moni Sharkar, for example, said to me when she was a little girl, when she was about 7, 8 years old, she would be going from house to house in her village in Khulna, where, you know, she would learn different stitches with different women. She also knew who made a pillow cover better than the ruffles for a hand fan. So she would go over there to work with them on a different um, object. And likewise, you know, there are women who will say, so and so draws a beautiful peacock, right? So and so has a very sure hand for writing the words that I will stitch. So there's, you know, there's many ways in which I think people may have shared their skills. For sure, we know that women talk about having sat together in the afternoons to embroider, which I think immediately opens up a kind of, you know, a stitching club kind of environment. Maybe shared, maybe competitive. We don't really know, you know, what the dynamics were like, but certainly the possibility of interaction, right? Of
Mhm.
various kinds, even if it's hovering over each other's work and commenting and critiquing.
Right.
Yeah.
It provides a means of socializing in some ways. So this also relates to the contemporary stitching, this question from Kathy. To what extent has storytelling stitching prevailed as the contemporary revival of Kanta moved into garments/fashion? Maybe you can discuss the different ways in which these textiles have been used historically and then are used today.
Um, we think as production has become much more commercialized, right, the environment has probably shifted. I mean, I should qualify that I personally think there may have always been some amount of commissions, right? Even though people don't seem to talk about it in that way. And to give you an example, you know, I've heard many women talk about in the cities, talk about sending a kantha to the village. And by sending, what they mean is that somebody who works in their house is going to take it back to their village, where relatives who are really good at making kantha will use this old cloth and transform it into something new, for which some kind of, maybe not cash payment, but there is an exchange of some sort, right? Which allows the woman in the urban environment to be supporting the ones in, you know, in the village back in, I don't know, Nodia, Khulna.
Mm.
So there was always that kind of, you know, conversation. But I think because I was talking more to the urban middle class, upper middle class women, the full chain wasn't always entirely transparent. It's kind of like people would talk about, oh, I went there, but somebody drove you there. Your chauffeur took you. You know, that the agency gets obscured sometimes in the way ownership is articulated. Do you know what I mean? Whereas when I talked to their maids at the street corner, I heard it slightly differently. You know, my cousin is the one who really did that on that kantha. So that's with the more traditional domestic kantha, and sort of again a collaborative chain process that I think you have to dig to get the details of. But certainly the commercial productions are making this much more overt, right? Today, when you look at, or the places that I've looked at, these garment factory type environments where there are about 8 to 10 women sitting and stitching on one sari, right? At the same time, with their hoops, we're seeing um, a separation of multiple stages in a different kind of way, right? There's a set of women who are creating the drawings, transferring drawings that are established and given to them in templates of various kinds. And then there's another set of women who are stitching with a predetermined, group understanding of which stitches, what threads, how many, what thickness of thread, all of those decisions, right? To create a certain kind of uniformity, which hoops give you much better than, this just by hand version.
Right. Do we also have a privileging of certain narratives in this modern period? Do we have a diversity of narratives maybe in the 19th century that we now don't have, now that we have these sort of garment factories?
Yes and no. What I find very intriguing is that a kantha like this one, right, is being reproduced, for example, and sold over and over at a place like Arong, the big NGO production outlet in Dhaka, right? That boat is incredibly popular. I have seen various versions of that boat in so many different colors for cushion covers that I actually have in my house. Similarly, there's another very popular one, Manada Shundari's Gatha in the Gurshada Museum in Kolkata, right? I know of people in Philadelphia who have bed covers embroidered with very distinctive motifs from that kantha, right? So some themes have a certain popularity, and people are very clear that they go back to these museums to look at these things and to draw and, figure out relationships and variations also upon them. But, I've also seen kantha with the flag of Bangladesh. There are Rabindranath Tagore kanthas now, map kanthas, right? The range is shifting significantly, I think, but notionally not necessarily all that different. I think we're seeing the fashions of the day, right? We have all kinds of things, Humpty Dumpty, folk tales from various traditions. I've seen Shrek embroidered on a kantha, non-commercial, of course, right, in somebody's home. So
right.
It's, I think, like,
I should ask these. Oh, sorry, go, keep going, please.
I was gonna say, I think in the domestic end of things, there's a lot more malleability than we tend to assume in the genre, right? Because I think because people are drawing on what is available, like these prints may be inspiring certain motifs on kantha. I mean, I'm not saying necessarily that a woman was looking at a particular print, but it is actually pretty remarkable how closely this woman's imagery is matching up to the set of prints I showed you, right? And not all women are doing it with this kind of specificity. And I can give you a couple of examples of, if you want to see at some point. Right? Other versions of the boat ride, for example. I think I popped.
If you could pull those up, that would be great.
Yeah.
As you're pulling that up, I should ask, a bunch of people have asked about Sufi influence. So I should, please.
So you see how this woman has chosen to do the boat ride. It's a similar idea, but hardly that same kind of close, rendition of the, of everything from the decorative detail on the body of the boat done in circles now. Like there's not that same kind of logic. Kamala, on the other hand, makes sure her running stitches are so even that it begins to look like wet wood on water, right? Or if you look at this one, yes, much looser compared to her, remarkable amount of detail, including a butterfly. The position of the butterfly matches up to the print, right? So
that first one was so chaotic and frenzied. Yeah, that's gorgeous.
So
Okay, we're approaching 3 o'clock, so I should ask this question. A few people have asked about Islamic influence. So a couple of people asked about Sufi links and the composite images. And then Simone.
That's a great question. I should have probably put some images. There actually are a lot of these composite animals. Yeah, we find them in Persian manuscripts as well as Mughal manuscripts for sure, right? Camels are a very popular one, for example. And the person who's done the work on this is Aditya Behel, who translated several of the Sufi romances. I mean, he passed away, but before he passed away, we talked a lot about this kind of imagery. And the shared imagery of desire for the divine that we find visualized across different media. In Bengal, we don't have as much text manuscripts surviving, which is why we lean on the other media so much. But certainly in the heartland of the Mughal world and even the sultanates, there is a lot of this imagery of shared intertwined bodies. Yeah. And I'm thinking the Metropolitan Museum of Art has one if you pull up the collection, for example, off the top of my head. Yeah.
Okay, great.
There's also swings. Yeah. There's a Deccani painting, I'm thinking, my colleague Mali Akin, I think, first pointed me to it, of a prince swinging, and the swing is constructed of female bodies. We find the same form for Krishna also, right, in Prince. So Islamicate South Asia certainly shares a lot of visual imagery, and in the Bengali context, I mean, I would be very hesitant to think of these as exclusively Hindu or Muslim. There was one kantha, it blew me away when I first noticed it. Let me see if I have it here. Oh, maybe not. Sorry. That particular one has an image of Krishna stealing the clothes of the gopis up on a tree, right next to a pair of footprints that says Kadam Rasul and Ya Allah, right? And there's the Ramayana, the epic battle on the other side. So you begin to see that, a lot of the times, I think in the home, maybe they were not being as particular about what is Hindu or what is Muslim exclusively. And, I did a talk a couple of months ago, and it actually brought back an image from my own childhood. Not to be too obsessively personal, but I do remember as a little child, my great-grandmother's shrine had not only the full battalion of Hindu gods, but also a Kaaba image, right? She also had a Christ on a cross. It was not so exclusive as we might tend to think of it in our, ways of categorizing the material, right? And that is sort of my own instinctual way of relating to a kantha such as the one I'm telling you about, right? Where imagery is just, especially in the domestic context, shared. Now, exactly how these kantha get used may have particular resonances, across more Hindu or Muslim rituals. But maybe not. I mean, women are sitting and stitching, in the afternoon, right? Across a village. Might there be Hindu and Muslim women sitting and stitching? I would imagine yes, at an earlier time.
Great. I think that will be very helpful for my students to think about this shared imagery across various traditions and moving away from these categories that we've been kind of forcing down, or I've been forcing down the students' throats. There are 10 avatars, and this one's this one's this one's this, asking how could the Buddha possibly be an avatar? It's a lot messier than that in the lived reality of religious people. Hindus who have shrines with all sorts of diversity of images from what we might categorize as conflicting traditions. So thank you so much for this talk. We've come to 3 o'clock. I'm sure my students will have more questions for you on Tuesday, but this was really beautiful. I'm so glad we could just spend some time with these images today. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I'd just like to add that Dr. Ghosh's new book, Making Kanta, Making Home, can be ordered from the Carlos Museum bookstore. So go to carlos.emory.edu and click on the bookstore, or contact our bookshop manager, Mark Burrell, and he would be delighted to order this beautiful book for you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Should I stop the screen share?